Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something really fascinating about modern Italy. It's this unified nation, famous for its culture, but beneath the surface, there's this persistent economic and social gap between the North and the South.
Right.
It's more than just talk. It's something that really impacts the country day to day. So our goal here is to unpack how this divide came about and, maybe more importantly, why it's still such a big deal.
Exactly. And in this deep dive, we're going to try and analyze how this economic dualism was, well, constructed. It wasn't inevitable, not just down to geography or culture.
Right.
It emerged from specific historical events, policy decisions, and institutional failures, especially right after Italy unified politically in 1861. We want to get past the simple explanations and look at the actual mechanisms.
Okay, so to really get a handle on this, we probably need to go back. Back to Italy just before 1861, before unification. What did the peninsula look like then? Politically, economically, were the differences already baked in?
Oh, absolutely. Before 1861, Italy wasn't a single entity. It was a collection of quite distinct states. The two key players, especially for this story, were the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia up in the north and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies covering the south.
Right.
And they were very different. In the north, Piedmont-Sardinia was actively modernizing under Count Cavour. He brought in liberal economic policies, slashed tariffs, signed trade deals with major powers like France and Britain.
Go.
It was a strategic push, financed significantly through sovereign debt, to position Piedmont as, well, a modern state on the European stage.
Mm-hmm.
And you saw early industrial growth there, especially textiles, silk, and they were already laying down plans for an integrated railway system, a clear move towards industrialization.
So Piedmont was looking outwards, modernizing. How did that stack up against the South, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies?
It was a stark contrast, really. The South, under the Bourbon monarchy, was overwhelmingly agrarian. Its economy was still deeply shaped by a kind of feudal legacy. Land was concentrated in these huge estates, the latifundia. And most people were impoverished peasants, the contadini,
Right.
working that land. Now, the South did have some impressive industrial spots, like the Pietrarsa engineering works near Naples, actually the largest industrial plant in Italy at the time,
Really?
and the shipyards at Castellammare di Stabia. But these tended to operate within a sort of protectionist bubble, a paternalistic system. It shielded them, maybe, but it also stopped a wider, market-driven industrial base from developing. And there wasn't the same push for an integrated transport network like in the North. The foundations were just fundamentally different.
It sounds pretty clear-cut then, these differences. But you mentioned historians actually debate how big this gap was before unification. Why is there disagreement there? What are the arguments?
Yeah, that's right. The exact size of the economic gap before 1861 is actually quite a contentious point for historians. The sort of prevailing view, argued by people like Francesco Nitti and later Antonio Gramsci, is that, yes, there were already substantial differences: infrastructure, economic organization, living standards. Gramsci, for example, argued the North had this longer tradition of city-state autonomy, which fostered, a middle-class capitalism, whereas centuries of outside rule in the South kind of stifled that.
I see.
But then there's a revisionist view. Nitti himself, actually, early on, argued that maybe the economic differences weren't that marked before 1860, that the real divide was more a consequence of the policies after unification. This view points out that large-scale industry was pretty rare across the whole peninsula, not just the South, and that Piedmont's modernization drive, funded by debt, had actually put it under considerable financial strain itself.
That's a fascinating wrinkle. So it's not just bean-counting history. It sounds like it gets political very quickly.
Yeah.
Assigning blame, almost.
Exactly that. The debate isn't just academic. It plugs right into the politics of the Southern question. Is the divide the fault of the new Italian state, or was it down to deeper historical trajectories? Either way, if you look at the data from just after 1861, the divergence is pretty clear. Literacy rates in Piedmont were, more than double the South's? Industrial output was significantly higher in the North. These weren't minor gaps. They showed different paths already being taken.
Given those differences, which sound pretty profound, it makes the actual act of unification seem even more complex. How did it actually happen? Was it really a coming together?
Well, coming together isn't quite how it played out. It was much more a political and military expansion led by Piedmont. The key event was in May 1860. Giuseppe Garibaldi's famous Spedizione dei Mille, the Expedition of the Thousand.
The red shirts.
Exactly, his volunteer red shirts. They landed in Sicily and, remarkably quickly conquer the kingdom of the Two Sicilies.
Yeah.
But Count Cavour, the Piedmontese prime minister, was, let's say, wary of Garibaldi's Republican leanings.
Right, he didn't want a republic.
He skillfully maneuvered behind the scenes to make sure the newly conquered territories were annexed directly into the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia under King Victor Emmanuel II. So Piedmont's constitution, its laws, its institutions, even its high spending budget, all of that was basically extended pretty much overnight to the entire new country. The South was effectively absorbed.
Absorbed. That sounds quite different from a partnership. What did that mean for people in the South? What were the immediate effects, and how did the new Italian state handle it?
For many Southerners, especially the rural poor, this didn't feel like liberation. It felt more like a forced annexation, like being taken over by a foreign power, almost. And this feeling was amplified by the new policies that came in immediately.
Such as?
Well, the Piedmontese tax system, for one. It was designed for the relatively wealthier North. It was suddenly imposed on the much poorer South. Then there was mandatory military conscription taking young men away from farms and families. And crucially, church lands were confiscated, but they weren't redistributed to the peasants who desperately needed land. That caused huge disillusionment.
And I imagine that disillusionment didn't just stay quiet.
Not at all. It exploded into violence. What's known as the Gran Brigandage, the Great Brigandage. This was basically a guerrilla war that lasted from about 1861 to 1865. Bands of former Bourbon soldiers, angry peasants, local outlaws, they fought against the Italian army. They saw it as an invasion.
A civil war, almost.
In effect, yes, a brutal one. And the new Italian state's response wasn't negotiation or reform. It was pure repression. They were terrified this rebellion would break the new nation apart. So they declared a state of siege in the South.
Wow.
The army was sent in with immense power. Laws like the Pica Law basically legalized incredibly harsh measures, mass arrests, summary executions. It was incredibly brutal. And this, combined with the broken promises of reform, really cemented a deep, lasting distrust between the Southern population and the new Italian state. What should have been unity felt like betrayal. It poisoned the well right from the start and laid the groundwork for this whole Southern question.
Which brings us right to that term, the Southern question meridionale. You mentioned it emerged pretty quickly. When exactly was that, and what did it signify for the people in charge?
The term itself, question meridionale, was apparently coined by a Lombard politician, Antonio Bilia, back in 1873. So yeah, just about a decade after unification, it shows the elite recognized pretty quickly that they had a major problem on their hands, a serious imbalance.
Okay.
And this is where those intellectual debates we talked about earlier, Nitti, Gramsci, really gained political teeth. Nitti argued forcefully that the new state's policies were actively making the South poorer, essentially blaming the government. Gramsci, on the other hand, saw the roots deeper in the South's history, its backwardness. Economically, the new state had inherited Piedmont's large debt. To pay it off, they implemented high taxes across the board. But the Southern economy just couldn't bear that burden in the same way the North could.
So these economic policies weren't neutral. It sounds like they actively widened the gap.
They absolutely did. They repositioned the South's role in the national economy. A key moment was the introduction of protectionist tariffs, especially from the late 1870s onwards. These were mainly designed to protect the North's growing industries from foreign competition.
Right.
But the side effect was devastating for the South. Its agricultural exports, a major part of its economy, suddenly found it much harder to compete internationally. At the same time, the South's own smaller industries, which had existed under the old protectionist system, couldn't compete within the new Italian free market against the more developed northern factories. They were basically dismantled.
So the South became dependent.
Structurally, yes. It was pushed into becoming primarily a supplier of raw materials and agricultural goods for the industrializing North. And even when the state did invest public money in the South, it wasn't always helpful. They built railways. Yes, infrastructure increased. But if you look at things like literacy rates, the big improvements were mainly in the center and North. It suggests Southern investments were often more about political control or appearances than about building real economic capacity or, crucially, human capital. It locked in that economic dualism.
And as we move into the later 19th and early 20th centuries, that's when the North really takes off industrially, isn't it? What drove that surge, and why did the South get left even further behind?
That period really cemented the divergence. Italy's Industrial Revolution, its takeoff, happened almost entirely in the North. It created what's still called the Industrial Triangle: Turin, Milan, Genoa.
The powerhouse.
Several things fueled it. There was already a base in textiles and silk. Then came strategic state investment in heavy industries: steel, shipbuilding. And a huge factor was harnessing hydroelectric power from the Alps, what they called white coal. This powered the factories. Big names we still know today, like Fiat and Pirelli, emerged then. They became symbols of this northern dynamism built on a close relationship between industry and the state.
A kind of perfect storm for northern growth.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, in the South,
Meanwhile, the South's economy stayed overwhelmingly tied to agriculture, and an agriculture that wasn't really modernizing effectively. It was hit particularly hard by the agricultural crisis in the 1880s, making life even tougher for most people. The numbers really tell the story. If you look at industrial output indexes from, say, 1871 to 1901, the gap between North and South just gets wider and wider. It shows that this wasn't just about pre-existing conditions. The way Italy developed economically actively made the problem worse. It was like, as you said, building a high-speed train, but only laying the track in one half of the country.
that's a really stark image. And the human cost of that widening gap, you must see that in migration patterns.
Oh, massively. The human impact was just enormous. It led to huge waves of internal migration, primarily from the south to the north. We're talking millions of people. Between the 1950s and 1970s alone, estimates are over 4 million Southerners moved north, looking for work in the factories of cities like Turin and Milan.
4 million. That's staggering.
It is. Think about the impact on Southern communities. People left because of, well, harsh conditions, poverty, lack of steady jobs, land that just couldn't support them anymore. Now, this influx obviously caused social changes and some tensions in the north, but the really damaging long-term effect was on the South itself.
How so?
It drained the region of its youngest, most ambitious, most able-bodied workers. It created this chronic brain drain, especially of anyone with skills or education. This structurally weakened the Southern economy even further, reinforcing its dependence. And it's a pattern that incredibly continues even today.
Beyond just economics and policy, there's the shadow of organized crime looming large over the South. What are its origins? How did groups like the mafia become so embedded there?
Right. Organized crime is inextricably linked to this story, and its roots are really in institutional failure, going right back to unification. Groups like the Sicilian Mafia, the Campanian Camorra, the Calabrian and 'Ndrangheta, they emerged in the vacuum left when the old feudal order collapsed, and the new Italian state couldn't, or didn't, effectively establish its authority, provide security, or ensure justice across the South.
So they stepped into the void.
Essentially, yes. Take the mafia in Sicily. Its origins aren't really in generalized poverty, but specifically in providing services protection rackets for wealthy landowners, especially around Palermo with the valuable citrus groves. They offered extra-legal enforcement, settled disputes, guaranteed order for a price, using violence and intimidation to create monopolies.
So less Robin Hood, more a parallel predatory state.
Precisely. It became a functional substitute for state functions, but a deeply corrupting one. And this relationship was often symbiotic. Landowners sometimes actively used the mafia to keep peasant movements in check, to control labor. So from the very beginning, it was tangled up with local, political, and economic power.
And how did that affect governance more broadly?
It corroded it. Through clientelism, exchanging favors for political support, through outright corruption, through intimidation, these organizations undermined the legitimate state at every turn. They distorted the business environment with extortion, making it incredibly difficult for honest businesses to thrive or for outside investment to feel secure. While the different groups, Mafia and 'Ndrangheta, Camorra, have their own structures and histories, they all share this origin in weak state presence and political collusion. It created a legacy of low social trust and endemic corruption that still haunts the region.
After the Second World War, there must have been attempts by the Italian government to finally tackle this divide head-on. What did they try, and did it work?
Yes. After WWII, the Italian Republic made its most significant large-scale effort. This was the Cassa per Mezzogiorno, the fund for the South set up in 1950. The idea was to pump massive amounts of public money into the South to stimulate growth. Infrastructure, public works, credit subsidies for businesses trying to attract investment.
Sounds ambitious. How did it pan out?
Well, its results were mixed at best. And ultimately, many argue it was counterproductive. Initially, the focus was on agriculture and basic infrastructure, roads, waterworks, but that didn't seem to move the needle enough. So by the 1960s, the strategy shifted.
Shifted how?
Towards a top-down, heavy industry approach. The state poured money into building these huge, often state-owned manufacturing plants, steelworks, chemical plants, car factories, but these became known as cathedrals in the desert.
Why that nickname?
Because they were often enormous, technologically advanced, but completely disconnected from the local economy. They were capital intensive, meaning they didn't actually create that many local jobs relative to the investment. They didn't spark much related industry around them. And worse, by the 1970s and 80s, the Cassa itself became notorious for inefficiency, mismanagement, and frankly, widespread corruption and political patronage. Huge amounts of money were wasted or siphoned off. Some estimates say maybe a third of the funds just vanished.
So good intentions, maybe, but terrible execution. It didn't fix the core issues.
It proved that just throwing money at the problem wasn't enough. You couldn't compensate for the deep-seated institutional weaknesses, the lack of trust, the influence of crime, the underdeveloped human capital, just by building a giant factory. In fact, some argue it actually reinforced the dependency culture.
That's quite a damning assessment. Did anything work better?
Well, it's interesting to contrast it slightly with something like the Marshall Plan earlier. Although much smaller in scale for Italy, its focus on rebuilding basic infrastructure after the war, reconnecting farms to markets, seemed to have more tangible positive effects, at least in agriculture. It suggests maybe a more bottom-up approach could have been more effective. But the Cassa's failure ultimately just cemented the North's industrial dominance, while the South lagged, perpetuating that two-speed Italy.
Which brings us right up to today. After all that history, unification, policies, failed interventions, does this divide still define Italy? Hasn't EU membership, modern life, started to close the gap?
You'd hope so, but the reality is stark. The North-South divide remains incredibly persistent. It's woven into the fabric of modern Italy. The economic numbers are still telling. Just a few years ago, GDP per capita in the South was still only around 55% of the Center-North's level.
Wow, still that low.
Yes. And Eurostat data from 2021 really paints the picture. Lombardy, in the north, had a GDP per capita at 127% of the EU average. Calabria, down in the south, was at just 56%. That's a massive divergence within one country, one EU member state. It shows how structural the problem is. Decades of policies, EU funds, they haven't managed to bridge that fundamental gap.
And the social consequences. We talked about historical migration. Does that continue?
Absolutely. The economic disparity fuels ongoing social problems. Youth unemployment is chronically high in the South, much higher than the national average. And this directly drives the modern brain drain we touched on earlier. It's not just unskilled labor leaving now. It's often the most educated and skilled young people. Nearly half of all Italians living abroad today originally come from the South.
Yeah, that's incredible.
It is. And it creates this vicious cycle. The South loses the very people it needs to innovate, to build businesses, to drive future growth. So the region struggles to attract investment, and it's constantly losing its best human capital. The data today confirms this isn't just a historical issue. It's an active, dynamic problem that's undermining the South's future.
It seems almost intractable. Why does it endure so stubbornly despite everything, even within the framework of the EU?
It really comes down to those deep-rooted issues we've discussed. The legacy of institutional weakness is still there. Corruption remains a significant problem, eroding trust and hindering development. That lack of social trust, particularly between citizens and the state, is a major barrier. And the continuous outflow of human capital just keeps weakening the foundations. These aren't problems that can be fixed with short-term projects or simple cash injections. They're historical legacies, embedded over 150 years, resulting from specific choices and failures. They create a structural disadvantage that's incredibly difficult to overcome.
So if we take a step back from the details and look at the whole story we've traced today, from before unification right up to the present, what does this deep dive into Italy's North-South divide really teach us about the idea of national unification itself?
I think it teaches us a powerful, perhaps cautionary lesson. Italy achieved political unification, yes. It became one state on the map, but it fundamentally failed to achieve economic and social unification. The North-South divide isn't just some accident of geography or culture. The evidence strongly suggests it's a man-made problem.
Man-made how?
Rooted in specific choices. The way unification happened more conquest than merger. The harsh repression that followed, creating lasting distrust. The economic policies like tariffs that explicitly favored northern industry at the expense of southern agriculture and potential. And the profound failures of governance, allowing organized crime to take root, mismanaging huge development funds like the Cassa. All these things actively created and perpetuated this dual economy. Two-speed Italy isn't just a phrase. It's the enduring legacy of that flawed unification process.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.